Work for it, ride for it, I'ma organize for it. Stay up in the night and in the morning, I'ma rise for it. Heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it. Peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it. Work for it, ride for it, I'ma organize for it. Stay up in the night and in the morning, I'ma rise for it. Heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it. Peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it.
All right, hey, peace. Thanks for tuning into the Money, Power, Land, Solidarity podcast. I am really excited about today's interview. We are here with the author of the cover piece in the latest edition of The Nation, titled "The Man Who Saw It Coming, the Unemployed Epidemiologist Who Predicted the Pandemic." Local writer, hero, in effect, on the South Side. Thanks for joining us, Eamon Whalen.
Thank you for having me, Jake. First time, long time.
Hell yeah, right? Dope. I really wanted to start, though, by just bigging you up, man. Like, Eamon, you've been writing and pursuing your craft as a journalist and a writer for many years, like covering the local hip-hop scene, covering local social justice movements, really grinding it out and working on your craft and elevating these stories. And we've all known in the Twin Cities how talented you are and the passion you have for your work. So to see you have a cover piece in The Nation, like I was saying, like we didn't need that to validate you, but to see your work getting the exposure that it deserves, huge salute to you. And I just want to say, I was super excited to have you come over and get on the mic today, because this is the best piece of writing, the most clarifying piece around the pandemic that I've read around COVID, and I'm so excited to share with our listeners. So salute to you, congratulations, and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for those kind words. Yeah, I mean, it's an honor to hear that. Been, I guess, trying my best. Freelance writing, any kind of writing can be a bit of a slog. So it's really keeping to it, and once in a while, maybe something like this leaks through, and you get the right timing. A lot of it is luck, to be honest. I guess grinding is, helps you get more of those chances to be lucky.
Yeah, but it's like what they say, are you ready to work for 10 years to be an overnight success? You know what I'm saying?
Oh, okay.
I've heard that a lot.
That's fair. That's a good way of putting it.
Hell
but yeah, and I appreciate the clarifying. I mean, that was really, like I told you yesterday when we were texting about it, I was really found this guy, Rob Wallace's work, said Unemployed Epidemiologist, to be so clarifying about the origins of the pandemic. And not only that, but then also how we've been experiencing it. It's been operating, convulsing through the body politic, however you want to say it, both from the preparation, the reaction, to now how it's seemingly not stopping. He's been very clarifying on a lot of it, and he just had such an amazing, also personal story. So.
Can we start there? Like, so this piece is really talking about this man, Rob Wallace, this epidemiologist, this unemployed epidemiologist. How did you get hip to his work, and like, what caught your eye about it, and how did it get to the point where you decided to profile him for this piece?
So I was doing a piece last year. It was actually had started in 2019. That was for The Nation. That was about sort of like the politics of meat and nutrition and kind of the right-wing co-optation of certain diets and things. And basically it had been sitting on the shelf for a while, and the editor came back and wanted me to try to make it about COVID. And I was like, okay. So I tried to sort of look at how, and I had sort of noticed how things were, meatpacking plants and meat shortages were a thing at the beginning of the pandemic. And so I was getting into that sort of connection between the meat sector and pandemics. And then I basically just through internet research found this guy, Rob Wallace, who had written a book called Big Farms Make Big Flu in 2016, which was all about the connection of factory farms of mostly poultry and hog, and how those create the perfect conditions for pandemics. And so that ended up just being actually just a sort of one-line mention in that last article, but then I just kept following his work, following all his interviews. I got his book. He came out with another book about the pandemic that I got, and I just, I guess more broadly, I was like, where did this come from? Why did this happen? Because most people were like, well, there's a pandemic in 1918 and it's about 100 years later and we're just due for another one. And that's just kind of the way it happens. And that's really not the case as far as his analysis would have it be.
Right. So you talk about, you pull quotes. You said he wrote that book, Big Farms Caused Big Flu, in 2016. You have a quote early in the piece of him in 2007 saying a pandemic is all but inevitable at this point. And he was talking about the H5N1 avian influenza.
Yeah.
And like, that's really like the launching off point of your piece, is that this guy's been ringing the alarm for many years, over a decade. So can you kind of like just give us a summary of like, why was he making that prediction? What about his work led him to that conclusion?
Yeah. So I should say Big Farms Make Big Flu is it's a collection of his writings over the course of probably 10 years, from like 05, 06 to 2016. And so he was a molecular biologist, and he also says public health phylogeographer, which is sort of, we can get into that later with that.
I did write down that term.
Phylogeography means.
Yes.
And so he had done a study when he was in his postdoc at University of California, Irvine, that he got into. They had pinpointed where the bird flu had come from, where the outbreak had come from in Guangdong in the late 90s, but he was just very curious why it was there in the late 90s. And then he basically got beyond his natural scientific parameters and got more into agriculture, political economy, sociology, more into the social sciences, to sort of put together this theory of epidemiological sort of perfect storms that were being created by the way that we use land, and the way that basically big industrial farms operate with deforestation in sort of a 1-2 punch way, if that makes sense. And so I guess he'd been ringing the alarm because we had a lot of very near misses, I think he would say, from even SARS in 2001, bird flu, swine flu, Ebola, and then a lot that I hadn't even heard of before I had started looking into this. And so essentially by building mega big farms with the same animal packed all together, that creates for very high chances of producing a super virus from the lack of biodiversity. When you build farms on the edge of a dwindling forest that you've cleared out most of it to build the farm, then you start to let a lot of wild animals, pathogens, start to interface with humans that are also interfacing with the farm animals, and you basically just allow these pathogens a lot more chances to all evolve and multiply and get more virulent. And then because these farms are based on commodity export, you now have perfect journeys out to big cities where public health has been stripped down, and it essentially just is. It's by his analysis, we've kind of created the perfect environments for these pandemics to just ravage society.
Yeah, and that right there, just that analysis of like thinking about those things together, thinking about our political economy. That's a word that I try to use a lot on this show, because I think we're taught in the United States to think about economics as like a discrete, separate science that has like immutable laws, and it's not related to anything else. Only the experts know about that, and it's not political. It's like the market has like a law that we have to follow, and it's so not true, and it's so important for us to break that down. And what I was really resonating with in Rob Wallace's piece is his journey of like science, understanding that science is not a discrete category from economics or politics, that like you can't understand these viruses if you're not talking about factory farming and deforestation and rapid urbanization. And just the way that was stressed in this piece was so clarifying. I remember for me, I was listening to a podcast, This Is Hell, and
he's been on that like 4 times.
Okay, dope. It might have been him. I don't even know. But I remember somebody making this connection. I was kind of half listening and saying that like the pandemic was the result of industrial agriculture. And that was ringing in the back of my head the whole pandemic. And that's the only time I've ever heard that analysis. So many of us are so lost at understanding like what this is and where this came from. So this piece is just like, I think such a crucial perspective and such important information for people to draw those connections.
Yeah, we can actually, to hop back to another reason why I wanted to profile him was because I found there to be a sort of dearth of analysis of the origins of COVID in a more structural way. Like people was like, okay, yeah, it could have come from a bat or this, wet market, quote unquote wet market in China. Now the lab leak thing it's reemerged as a possibility for some people. But there wasn't really much of a conversation about the broader structures in political and economic and widely historical currents that are producing this. And he does occasionally get spots on major media he's been interviewed by Vox or The Guardian or even Late Night with John Oliver, but they don't really get into his broader sort of economic analysis. He's sort of known that he provides some commentary based on how factory farms create virulence, but he doesn't they don't allow him to do the full scope of his analysis, which I wanted to do, and then also talk about.
Yeah, exactly, and we'll get more into that. I think the implications for his life, his career, this analysis has had, and it's really, I think, a great window to talking about COVID, because if you look at Rob Wallace's analysis, you understand that COVID is a disease of capitalism, and so is the aftermath, the way that it's ravaged the United States, and you really can't talk about the implications of recovering from COVID or moving to a situation where we're not at risk of having these types of pandemics without a real devastating critique of the whole capitalist system. It's just like talking about climate change. So it's really disgusting the way we've treated the pandemic, but it's an opportunity for us to get honest about our political economy and what needs to change. And that's another thing I thought was great about your piece. Again, I haven't heard people, if not for a journalist like you who's willing to go there, we wouldn't get that full analysis, and it leaves space for then people to come in with these, it was an act of war by the Chinese, or
right.
it's a hoax, and
right.
just like if you take people's frustrations and skepticisms with their realities and with our systems, and then if you don't provide real hard analysis where people can connect the dots, it makes a lot of room for people to step in with hoax theories and conspiracy. So the timing of this was so good, I think, because I've been even having kind of trying to gauge how much to engage in the public conversation around COVID, because it gets so frustrating. But I'm realizing that doesn't mean we shouldn't disengage. We really got to come with a Marxist, socialist analysis that really makes these connections, and we can get out of this problem. We don't have to keep producing these pandemics, and we can create a public health system. But that means looking at changing the way we do agriculture, changing the way we move commodities around the world, and changing the way we care for one another as a society.
Yeah, I that's exactly how I felt. I felt like he was an antidote his analysis was an antidote both to right-wing nationalist, either nationalist like warmongering with China, or sort of blaming the dirty natives sort of tropes of blaming people, they eat nasty stuff over there.
Right.
Those sort of racist tropes, to it's a hoax and it's not real. And then also an antidote to the very feckless sort of believe in science liberalism that doesn't, and it's sort of parallel to a lot of things with Trump, because he was so hideous. It was basically like anyone can step in, provide some basic level of competency, and then they become a national icon, a la Cuomo or Fauci is mostly who I'm talking about.
Right, exactly.
Epidemiologists or the CDC, and I didn't actually put this in the piece, but I met with him in late June, and he basically predicted this upsurge of the Delta variant, that the repealing of the mask mandate was vastly premature, based mostly on getting America to reopen for business. And that's kind of the other thing of the timing right now, is that it's seeming like it's not going away all the way. And it kind of seems like to be able to do that, you have to freeze the profit motive,
Right.
for a good amount of time. Basically.
Certainly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and it's like, again, this gave me the courage and kind of the interest and the optimism to want to like study more. I've done a little bit of studying, but my understanding is that the countries who were able to stop the spread and able to not be ravaged like we were countries that have some checks on the market that could close down for weeks at a time, and then had a public infrastructure to deliver people food and to deliver people what they need, and really not give the virus the hosts to move around, you know. And like, when in a society so market dominated like us, we simply can't do that, and we will never get out of this situation if we can't. Like, that's just the truth. I wanted to speaking about kind of Dr. Fauci and establishment epidemiology and establishment science. You had a quote from Rob Wallace in your piece, something to the effect of like, epidemiologists are like a stable boy following with a shovel, following around a circus elephant. What did he mean by that?
It's basically that epidemiology as a field right now, as it currently stands in what he would call this age of pandemics, operates completely post hoc or post outbreak. There isn't very much work being done into, like, there is some in terms of, I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, in terms of people are trying to identify where viruses are and where viruses emerge, but natural scientists are handcuffed by the funders of their research, essentially. So you can only go so far to pointing out like who is funding these land grabs and pathogenous farming methods and land grabs that cause deforestation, to the point where they have very conflicting, contradictory duties to do, because they're trying to operate as scientists within this establishment that is causing these problems while also trying to figure out how to solve them. And so it's really, they're just cleaning up after, he does in his very funny way, is like just a bunch of elephants shitting everywhere, and they have to just play cleanup the entire time, essentially.
And what were the implications? Now I'm like, we can kind of just weave back and forth. I want to talk more about Wallace's story off of what you just said. How did that impact him specifically? Because he worked at the University of Minnesota. Yeah. And he talks about, like you said, he identified that, okay, in the 90s in southern China, that's when there was this outbreak of, was it bird flu that was first?
Yeah, that was the first one.
And then he said, at that point, I got curious, and that's a bad career move for a scientist.
Right.
Because he started to ask these other questions about political economy, about what was happening there. And I want to like walk through this to get into some of to continue to break down and get at these points of industrial agriculture and political economy. So tell me if I'm getting this correct. At that time in China, it was when they opened themselves up to some market reforms. It was kind of the post-Mao. So areas that were formerly doing subsistence agriculture were invested in. Huge capital operations came in where they created farming for commodity export. And that's a huge thing for people to understand. So rather than farming to produce for the needs of the people around you, which might include a more diversified crop system, it might include a more diversified husbandry. You might have multiple types of herds on a size that works in sustainability with the local environment. But when you start producing for the capitalist export market, that's when large swaths of land are cleared, and that's when these big factory operations, so then you have thousands of the same animal together in close quarters. And the way that they're being raised is simply for commodity export, which means that's why, people are probably familiar with this in the United States. You have the disgusting hog farms and the disgusting chicken farms in the United States where the animals are treated inhumanely and they're bred not thinking of like their holistic health, but just to have the biggest breasts or to be able to produce the whatever the fuck, you know what I'm saying? Biggest pork chops, whatever. So at that time in China, you had this huge change, and now you have these farms where tons of animals of the same breed are together on a farm, and that creates this situation where you can have what's the word? A zootological.
Zoonotic.
What's a zoonotic spill?
Like a zoonotic pathogen in basic terms is a pathogen or virus that comes from a wild animal, is able to mutate in a way where it's being able to spread to a human, and then mutates in a way that humans are able to spread to other humans.
And that's what these diseases that Rob Wallace
is. That's what Ebola is. That's what bird flu is. That's what swine flu is. That's actually.
So that's it. So Rob Wallace realized then, he thought, why was this happening in China? He put those pieces of that puzzle together that, okay, it was these market reforms and this producing hogs, and what else was they producing?
Duck and chicken.
And duck and chicken for the export market. That's why he started making those points. And what implications did making those connections have on his career? And why specifically was the University of Minnesota a bad place for somebody with Wallace's analysis?
Yeah, so the way he tells it is that he was finishing his postdoctoral studies where he had done that official study of bird flu. Then he had gotten curious about that question, like you said. And then after UC Irvine, he had applied for a tenure track job in the University of Minnesota geography department. And then he suspected that there was a dispute between two factions of the department, and he was, I think by some of the things he had published or what he was known for, that analysis, he was seen as being political or politicizing and magnifying this faction in the department. And then so he gets, instead of the tenure track, he gets hired on a 1-year contract position, which in academia, that's a fairly tenuous job to have. People want to be on a tenure track so then they can eventually get to a point where they have the amount of academic freedom to not get fired for talking about capitalism, et cetera. This is in 2008, he gets the job. 2009 is one of the big breakouts of swine flu that people might remember. There was like an 2006 bird flu, 2009 swine flu. I want to say even some people I knew in Minneapolis got swine flu when it came through.
Yeah, I think so. I think I know some people too.
And so he, at the same time that he had that outbreak was happening, he was working this job that he felt that he was marginalized in, and then he had started a blog called Farming Pathogens, of which many of his writings come from blog posts on that blog. And so basically he talked about who was responsible for swine flu, which was Smithfield Foods pork plant. It was a pork plant in Veracruz, Mexico. And I didn't get too deep into the exactly what happened, but essentially his contract wasn't renewed, and he was given a visiting scholar at the Institute for Global Studies, which meant no salary, no office, no teaching appointments. And so
basically it's like a library card. You say
he said I had access to the library, and he could he had a profile on on research things, so he could upload his research, but they essentially iced him out, and he got the message. It wasn't some super climactic thing, but he was essentially he was delivered a message that what he was doing was kind of beyond the pale. And so then and this is actually one of the first reasons why I wanted to profile him, is because in one of his biographies on some website that he had written for, it said Rob Wallace is a epidemiologist who's consulted for the CDC and the FAO, which is from the UN, Food and Agriculture Organization, and he's also a deli clerk at a local sandwich shop. And I was just like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
That was why, and this kind of goes with the theme of the cover, is that there's this sort of sci-fi disaster movie almost narrative running through, where it's this heretic dissident scientist who's trying to warn everyone, and they just brush him off. And it's learning that in the middle of COVID, where I was reading this guy's prophetic predictions and then being wait, he had to work in the sandwich shop.
Yeah.
He should be where.
And then like the third act of the movie, like the big SUVs pull up to the sandwich shop and try to convince him to come back to work for us. You know?
Exactly.
Yeah. Hey, fuck them, Rob. Don't go back.
Yeah. No. Totally. I mean, that's kind of how he interprets it now. Is he's like, the system is in crisis, and so they're pulling for whoever's out there, sort of,
Yeah.
even if they do come with a bit of a different analysis.
Yeah. So you talked about, his writings on COVID-19. We got a copy here of Dead Epidemiologist on the origins of COVID-19. And we've already got into a little bit his analysis of the origins, like the political, economic structures of industrial farming, and we talked about that, and that's related to deforestation, so the idea that like you're clearing out the natural habitat for these animals who carry these potential zoonotic viruses, and in a healthy ecosystem, they have their own space and they have their own habitat. So the potential for spillover is it's not because Chinese people eat weird shit. It's because there's been a real crunch in their habitat. So then factory farms and this limited habitat and people are all bumping up against each other. And then right there is this huge host ground of these factory farms like we've talked about. So I just wanted to name that as well, that factory farming piece.
And then there's also now paths for those viruses to then travel to Hong Kong and then be in New York within a week.
Yeah.
Like it's a bit, these pandemics are sort of supercharged by globalization. And I think it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around globalization, but this is a kind of a good way to think about it, of how interconnected we are, where this virus can be in a bat cave in China and get here fast.
And it's another thing again why I think coming with like proactive, informed left critique is important, because that's another. You would think in the United States that anybody opposed to globalism is a Steve Bannon isolationist nationalist, and it's like I believe in global solidarity and internationalism, and I would love to find a way where we can exchange with one another, but it's fucking insane that you eat like a food product that has commodities from China, from South America, from all that got shipped somewhere else to get
from West Africa.
Exactly, that got shipped here to get packaged somewhere else and sent. That's completely unsustainable when we talk about climate, and now clearly when we talk about pathogens and epidemics. So the other piece of Dead Epidemiologist that you talk about and that runs through Wallace's work is not only an analysis of the origins and the economy, but a commitment to poor people and working people. And can you talk about how did, in Wallace's work, how does he cover the way this pandemic has really affected the poor worse? And that book is dedicated to 3 meatpacking workers. Could you just speak on that a little bit?
Yeah, I can actually. Yeah, so the book is in the memory of Enoch Benjamin, Raphael Benjamin, and Celso Mendoza, who are 3 meatpacking workers, all union members at Well. I'm forgetting what states they were from. Meatpacking's typically Nebraska, Iowa, places in the middle of the country. And so that is one way that he sort of highlights how it's been so I guess the way COVID has just shown, and I think he shows well in his book, like who is expendable to society, like literally who is disposable, who can die of this virus. And I guess because he's focused on the agriculture, one way and one thing he focuses a lot on in the book is meatpacking workers, which I had gotten into a little bit in my last piece, which meatpacking was the second most dangerous job in the country during COVID, first being line cook.
Goddamn.
And meatpacking plants is actually, they're fairly interesting in meatpacking plant towns. So they're actually some of the most diverse workforces in America, or workplaces. Up to like 10 languages can be spoken on a floor of a meatpacking plant at once.
Yeah, and if I'm pretty sure that a town like Worthington, Minnesota is a meatpacking plant. And if people aren't familiar, you think a town that's out there on the Iowa border, southern Minnesota, almost all people of color. You know what I'm saying? And
Latin American, East African, Southeast Asian.
Indeed.
Yeah.
I think about like all the way back to the hopeful primary days
Yeah.
and the Iowa caucuses and the way
Yeah,
that the Bernie
absolutely.
campaign
Yeah.
focused on those meatpacking workers. That, again, I think a rare glimpse in American politics when somebody was actually trying to serve the working class and also expose what the working class really looks like in this country. We don't think about all the immigrants in the middle of the country living in some small town, working long ass shifts in some sweaty, fucked up, stinky meat packing plants for really low wages.
Yeah, and so and the counties that have meatpacking plants in America were like 5 times worse during that height of COVID than rural counties that don't have meatpacking plants.
Wow.
So that was a way of sort of showing how, and it's because they're on those commodity flows from the rest of the world, and so the goal of the meat industry for a long time is to keep the workforce as vulnerable as possible because it's a really dangerous job. They want to make it hard to organize because the ultimate goal is keeping prices as low as possible in America for meat.
So we can go get a fucking chicken patty that's like tendons and some other shit for like 87 cents.
Or that like a chicken breast at the store is going to be way cheaper than like some good vegetables or something like that. And so the plants themselves, like, really, if you want to get into maybe some of the most barbarous labor conditions you can imagine, was at the beginning of the pandemic in meatpacking plants, where they did fuck all preparing for it. No sanitizer, masks. They were really downplaying it to the workers because these workers speak many different languages. It is more difficult for them to organize and communicate. And even at one Tyson chicken plant, managers had a betting pool for how many workers would get COVID, how many people would have COVID on the floor.
Wow. A couple times in this podcast, I've thought we need like revolutionary tribunals. Like, I'm down for an execution. That is so cruel. God damn.
Incredibly cruel. And a lot of times, like Kristi Noem, the governor of South Dakota, kind of well known now as a Trumpista, she basically blamed it on basically them being dirty immigrants who that's all coming from what they do at home. Things like that. And then, so I guess that's kind of one example, but I mean, he highlights the millions of people that have, now pretty inadequate unemployment insurance. I know it's good for some people, but not. Shoplifting of food staples is up way high. It's hard to quantify how many thousands of COVID deaths are probably due to evictions. We've noticed here how much badly the houseless epidemic has gotten because of COVID. So it's like, and it's something that he learned by doing his PhD dissertation on HIV/AIDS in New York, and how pandemics are mirrors to a society's most entrenched inequalities. Anyone who's being ground down by American society, a pandemic is just going to highlight that. It's going to fill it in.
Yeah. That leads me to another piece that I thought was really fascinating about Rob Wallace, was kind of his lineage. You know what I'm saying? And you talk about his work studying the AIDS epidemic in New York. Can you talk a bit about his parents? His parents seemed like ill people, and it kind of he didn't, like my mom would say, he didn't lick it off the ground.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and then the one last thing that I think you'll appreciate on his sort of highlighting poor and working class and struggling people is that in his intro of his book, when he's talking about, so I should add that he actually was one of the first people to get COVID in Minnesota.
I was going to ask that.
Yeah, he got COVID in March of 2020 because he was traveling to do speaking at an event, and he's pretty self-effacing in that he's basically saying, like, I, more than anyone in the world, should have known that what was happening in Wuhan was going to come here, but I too was like, sort of have this sense of imperial exceptionalism, and then I'm also a broke academic who needs the money from this lecture that I'm about to give.
Yeah, it was a real poetic quote in the piece. I forgot. It was like,
it's like a uniquely American moment wherein financial desperation meets imperial exceptionalism,
Yes,
which
I
is a
was
good
like,
taste of his writing. He's a
yeah,
good writer.
damn,
Yeah.
hell yeah.
But then so he gets that. He's at home. He's abandoned by the state. He's got his disease. He's got the disease he's been studying, and he's just hoping that he's going to survive. And then he's writing in the intro. He says, "Is it any wonder that I was thrilled when the 3rd precinct was burned?"
Wow.
And so he's like that's when I was like, oh, this guy doesn't give a fuck.
Yeah.
You know, like that's when I got almost the sense like this is like getting a scientist where he's like kind of off the record, giving you like exactly how he feels, sort of thing. And he's saying, and I think it'll be, I don't know, debated, talked about, speculated for years and years what the pandemic, how that contributed to the uprisings of last summer. And I think that's a much bigger conversation. But I think for me, in hindsight, it seems like the further away I get from it, the more consequential.
Yeah, I do think so too. I think that's a really good point. Huge fuel on that fire. When I even think about the months and days leading up to the uprising, life was becoming more and more unbearable. People were losing their fear. I think like just the disruption in our regular routines was allowing us to see all of us, to let some of that American exceptionalism fall off of us. I think it had a huge politicizing impact. Yeah. I think it's great too to just hear a scientist and a serious person state a simple truth like that, because we're so propagandized in right-wing America. But there's revolution is common sense. That might sound hyperbolic, but it's literally, our system is disgusting. If you look at our foreign policy, if you look at every aspect of our economy, the way we treat people in this country. So for like a guy who's not writing all the time about police brutality, who's tracking other parts of our economy, but who just understands how much the boot is on everybody's neck, it's simple common sense that like, yes, torch that motherfucker. Like it's nothing but a symbol of oppression. So that's like, I hope more and more people who aren't, who scientists and people from all walks of life can break through like the silence and the stiltedness of our public life and just recognize we need dramatic change. Like, and I want to get to it later, but another piece I was really, really excited about and I've been thinking a lot about is he talks about to do anything about the connections that he's making with his analysis requires a rural urban connection. It means that the poor farmers, the people working in the meatpacking plants, the people indebted to the big agro businesses who live out in rural America in the hinterlands need to make common cause with the people burning down the 3rd precinct in the cities, because we're catching the disease and don't have jobs and don't have public health infrastructure and are getting beat up by the cops and don't have adequate housing. And it's like, for me, thinking about the local elections and kind of like the professional managerial strata that gets all the attention in the city, that's not my class. And I'm around those people, but I'm realizing like I have more affinity, probably more experience and more common cause with people in rural America who are really struggling. So that's another thing I just really, really appreciated about your piece and his work, was like, we really, really got to get out of this culture war bullshit and start connecting poor people in the city, in the suburbs, and in the rural areas.
100%. Yeah, well, we can table that, but then to the parents, because it is. And speaking of fires, so his parents are named Roderick and Deborah Wallace. They're also scientists, and they're sort of lefties from the New Left era in the 60s. His dad told me he burned his draft card, and then they met when they were graduate students protesting a weapons research lab in New York. And then so they opened what Rob calls like a mom and pop shop science consulting service in New York City. But the biggest, maybe one of the bigger moments of their career that became a book that they wrote together was that they did a very interesting kind of, I guess you'd call it political urban ecology analysis of the Bronx's burning era. If people are familiar with that, it's like famous if you've ever watched a documentary about like the birth of hip hop or anything like that. It was from 1969 to 1976. The Bronx had frequent massive building fires. And at the time it was often blamed or used as a way to pathologize the poor black and brown people that mostly lived in the Bronx, and as a sort of justification to give them less social services. It was what the Daniel Patrick Moynihan called benign neglect. We're going to give the insane oxymoron that you could even say that.
Right.
And so they had discovered that it was not the people burning down their own communities, but it was a lot of the fires were due to years of weakening fire codes, reduced fire services that was done by the city of New York based on faulty data provided by the Rand Corporation that had also just been instrumental in the kind of Vietnam catastrophe. And so that was sort of an early way that I think a lesson for him, and kind of way of showing how science is not apolitical, and data can be totally manipulated.
Yeah.
And I think like in a way sort of foreshadowed some of his work.
Yeah, and you talk about even like they work collaboratively now. His parents are still writing, and they have writing credits on
his parents authored like multiple chapters. His dad and him wrote a book together, a more kind of technical science book. But yeah, his parents, they also come out of a very interesting and admirable, but sort of less active than it was now, like a lot of kind of left movements are of this sort of politicized scientists.
Yeah,
it was called like Science for the People, which is actually, it has revived now, and I think is even gaining more momentum with the pandemic. But yeah, they come out of this really cool tradition of scientists that took political stances. One of the guys who's more kind of famous in that tradition just actually passed, named Richard Lewontin, who is like him and this guy Richard Levins that Wallace often builds off their work. They wrote a book called The Dialectical Biologist that was sort of trying to introduce some of more kind of Marxist frameworks for interpreting natural science. So
that's really dope. That's really exciting. And again, the whole trust science, believe science, it can't be owned by the Democratic Party, because they don't follow science and its implications for real.
No,
so
we can see that with Line 3 and
exactly,
et cetera,
exactly.
Yeah.
So to have like scientists who have those skills, really making a commitment to justice and a commitment to people, and we need them so severely, so desperately, like we really do. And it's really important, like even.
Leftists tend to be, like me, for instance, more on the humanities side.
Exactly.
That's why, to clarify for anyone listening, I am not a scientist.
Right. You got to go straight to the source.
I'm doing my best to paraphrase and summarize a very, very more legit scientist.
Yeah. And now I'm realizing, like, I can't do shit that's worthwhile. So during the revolution, like, y'all got to give me a job writing poems or some shit, because I'm like, I'll do some grunt work, but the people who have these types of skills and research abilities really impress me.
Yeah.
That's another name. Did you talk to John Bellamy Foster for this piece?
Yeah.
That was really cool to me, because a really fundamental book for me was Marx's Ecology. I read that when I was in my 20s.
Cool.
And I was like, realizing like, I think I'm a communist. And when people ask me books about socialism or books about communism and Marx, that's something I'll really recommend, because I think it does a great job, like kind of just breaking down the ways that the capitalist system that depends on perpetual growth is really unsustainable, and that Marx had an ecological critique. What was it like talking to him? And can you talk just a little bit about that? Like, kind of how does Wallace's work kind of build on and rhyme with like a Marxist critique of industry, basically?
Yeah, and we can kind of like jump back to the narrative chronological narrative timeline like that. So he's loses his job, or he isn't renewed for a job at the U of M. He is basically kind of bitter and angry and by himself, broke, on living off unemployment, food stamps. Continues blogging and doing essays to the point where he like thinks he has like a book to shop around. No one takes it except for Monthly Review Press, which is a socialist magazine that is edited by John Bellamy Foster, who's the author of Marx's Ecology. He's a professor of sociology at University of Oregon, Eugene. And he just was like, astounded and really impressed by the way that Rob Wallace was able to synthesize natural science, social science, ecology, epidemiology. And like you were saying, they're both, you could say, scholars or adherents to the Marxist theory of metabolic rift, where essentially capitalist production, it creates a rift in our natural world by prioritizing these economic abstractions where the ecology is not seen as being integral to these financial transactions, essentially. And those are abstractions, and we treat them as more real than our ecological limits, and we can see how we're running into a lot of problems with that, whether it's pollution, climate change, mass extinction, pandemics. This is all because we've created this rift where we're treating something as more real and consequential than the actual ecology that it lives in. So not only do we live in a society, we live in an ecological society.
Hey, real shit. And that's like one of the primary insanities of American capitalism in general, is it makes you think you're not a part of the ecology. And I remember in John Bellamy Foster's book, he has an early example of I'm going to speak real, I'm going to summarize probably poorly, but it always stuck with me. And it was about early industrial agriculture and realizing that when they were producing, I forgot what it was that they were producing, but producing for export. I think it might have even been in England or in Europe. But after a couple of years, they had robbed the soil of all its nutrients.
Yes. That was Marx's
so devastating. Yeah, and so he was like, "What the? Obviously, it's not sustainable." So then, they had to go get guano, bat shit from South America, which disrupted all shit in South America, and it led to colonizing there. And they had to go back and try to pour that into the soil. So as early as the 1800s, when Mark was alive and observing, he was seeing what's catching up to us now. That if you plan an economy based on profit that doesn't respect the relationships and the sustainability of the soil, it's going to catch up to you sometime. And we live in that time. You can't. Another piece I thought was great that he talks about and you talk about was, in the public discourse around COVID, we're not hearing this critique of industrial agriculture as a reason. You either hear it was because the Chinese are evil or stupid. It's one of those two, or maybe both, And he was saying that that's allowed, that discourse is allowed and encouraged in the United States, and it's a part of the way that agribusiness externalizes. So they know that these consequences are coming from their actions, but they don't want to take responsibility for them. We have to take responsibility for them in all these other ways, through sick people, through dead people, through the remediation efforts we have to do. And that's another piece of, I think, Marx's ecology and looking at industry that we don't talk about in the United States is just like line 3 or pollution. All these things have a real cost. And in the way capitalism, the way that these corporations look at that as externalities. That's for somebody else to deal with. We're going to dump our Chevron excess shit in the rainforest in Ecuador and let them fucking people deal with it. And that's what we have to stop. We can't let them get away with that. These aren't externalities. These are the consequences of your actions that have to be dealt with.
Yeah, they leave it off their balance sheet because the most important thing to them is the next quarterly report, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
One really illustrative example of that and how it works in the meat industry that Wallace draws on from a journalist named Christopher Leonard, who wrote a book called The Meat Racket, was that part of the consolidation of the meat industry is that companies own all steps of the production, except back in the 60s, Tyson decided that they weren't going to own the farms. The farms were going to be owned by the farmers because a former Tyson lawyer admitted that if you put too many chickens together, it creates disease and it fucks the money up. So they essentially made that decision to externalize it. They effectively admitted that squeezing thousands of animals is going to produce more disease. And this is what started these exploitative contract relationships where these farmers are at the whims of the meat companies because they own the rest of the production chain, and they just have to focus on these farms that are fucking disease hots, they're in such a losing game,
Yeah. Yeah, really. You talk about, he mentions even in the piece about, the way that this corporate agriculture setup is affecting farmers in Minnesota. And I'm sure people have heard about like farmer suicides in India, but he was saying there's even been farmer suicides in Minnesota. Did you get into that?
There is farmer suicides in Minnesota. It's a lot of dairy farmers. There's a pretty good, I think it was Huffington Post video documentary about it a couple years ago. But yeah, I mean, it's a lot of your generations being stuck in this exploitative kind of debt-ridden relationship, and you're seeing the way of life, not to glorify or romanticize that, but for these people, it is a way of life that was significantly declining. And I think there's a sense of shame in not being able to continue on the family farm. There's also the isolation of living out in farm life. And so it's tragic.
And debt is a motherfucker. I got crazy debt. And I've thought about suicide before. I'll be honest. When I was in my mid-20s and I'm looking at my life, realizing like, fuck, I got 6 figures hung over me for this weak-ass college degree that don't do shit. So whenever I've heard about farmers being in debt and struggling with their mental health, I've always thought like, damn, I wish I could talk to those people and just make connections,
Yeah.
And it's like, just to get through it again, the economics of it, that means like when the farm owns the rest of the supply chain, it means that the farmer then, he got to go in debt to get the seeds from every year. And now the agribusinesses make
the animals
and they make seeds or animals that you can't get the seeds. They
well,
don't
and then
reproduce.
If there's an outbreak and they have to call, meaning kill all of the animals, they have to make up for that.
Yeah.
It's not so they've effectively externalized the most risky part of the proposition.
And so farmers barely making their nut back every year, getting out of debt. Yeah. They got farmers in a 360 deal. It's fucked up.
Facts. No, that's legitimately what it is.
I wanted to ask one other piece. I thought that was really interesting. Can you talk about the way that Wallace's research made him rethink of like viral hotspots? So talk about that a little bit. And even I thought it was interesting the way he proposed to rename some of these diseases.
Yes. So we can look at, he puts it in terms of that there are absolute geographies and there are relational geographies. So you can look at an outbreak and you can just look at that outbreak zone like in Guangdong or Wuhan or whatever. But it is also very important to look at how that geography is in relation to other geographies. And if that place, if Guangdong is this epidemiological hotspot, why is it like that? We've established that it's because of foreign direct investment that is having them build up these farms. Then, and that foreign money is coming from Hong Kong, then we should look at Hong Kong as being part of that hotspot, just as it is Guangdong, because it's sending the capital that is producing, it's producing the farms and environments and processes that create the viruses. And as is, we can think of London. He basically is just international centers of finance that are throwing these money all around the world to do these land grabs and to fund these farms. We should look at them as hotspots, and then it's no coincidence that they do become hotspots.
Yeah.
That these big cities do become hotspots afterwards, because that is where the circuits of capital are going to flow back to.
Right. I love that phrase, circuits of capital. Like, more of us need to understand that our world is being shaped by circuits of capital, big finance, investing, buying land, dictating what gets grown, what gets built. It's like a lot of rhymes to real estate in this. You know what I'm saying? Where like, even for us, it's easy to point to like the local players in the real estate market, but it's global finance that's involved in buying up your block and raising the rent and everything. So I just love to hear that circuits of capital is such like a helpful phrase.
Yeah, and so that goes into why he calls the swine flu the NAFTA flu, because the North American Free Trade Agreement that transformed the Mexican hog industry, makes it much cheaper and easier for American companies to go into Mexico and open up hog farms, other kinds of farms. And so swine flu, at least the outbreak in 2009, is thought to have emerged from a Smithfield pork plant in Veracruz, Mexico. And that was after NAFTA had totally transformed it. And so they had one of these hog hotels, or whatever you want to call it. And so he's essentially saying, like,
That's
not
where the police go for vacation.
it's not the hogs it's not the swine that decided to organize themselves together into so they are all creating the most disease-ridden things. It's the economic agreement that allowed them to be organized like that.
Right.
So that's why he calls it like NAFTA flu. And then or like Ebola, he calls it neoliberal Ebola. He actually wrote a book, like a more technical science book called Neoliberal Ebola. But this is pretty interesting because this is actually not through livestock farming. This is from palm oil. And this is from destroying deforestation that makes way for intensive palm oil plantations that again, bats, for whatever reason. Bats are reservoirs for coronaviruses or diseases. They're able to.
It's because they're vampire related.
Yeah. And so these palm oil plantations so we've transformed these bats' previous habitat. The palm oil plantations provides them food and shade. And so then you just have a lot of bats chilling in these palm oil trees. They start interfacing with the workers. Now these palm oil plantations are in parts of West Africa that have now been opened up to the commodity flows. They need to send the palm oil out. Previously, Ebola outbreaks would happen. They would be fucking terrible because Ebola is much more deadly than COVID, and they might wipe out a village. But now, because that is connected to some of those rapidly urbanizing place on planet Earth, which is these bigger cities in West Africa, they then
Go crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's another thing. That's like, I found this piece really made me hopeful. It made me optimistic. It made me feel informed, and also if these practices don't change, we're going to see something worse than COVID, is what Wallace is saying. That like, this is a deadly disease, but there's no saying it's going to stop here, and this could have been something more virulent and more deadly, and we really got to like heed his and others' call to like start doing things differently.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like seeing how Delta's happened, thank God that they were able to get that vaccine out. That's what he actually says that's the biggest thing that he got wrong, is that he didn't think that they were going to be able to make a vaccine this quickly. He thought it would take like up to 4 years or maybe never.
Fuck.
So, but can you imagine if Delta would have happened without the vaccines? Like it would have been really bad because we would have gone to another lockdown, but it seems like
probably not.
The economic incentives are making it so that no one is going to allow another lockdown to happen, Democrat or Republican.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was really a godsend that the vaccines were able to come out by now. But yeah, that's true, and it's really harrowing to think about. But it is, judging by his like track record, it is
worth paying
words
attention
that
to.
we should heed. Yeah.
Hell yeah.
I think what is it? I think it was maybe Mike Davis, who's also another
Mike Davis is dope.
Marxist, he wrote a book about bird flu, and he wrote the foreword for Rob Wallace's book. I was trying to interview him for this piece, but he's a bit of a recluse.
I bet.
But he was saying, like, Marxists are known for predicting 11 out of the last 4 Great Depressions. Like, we're just like, we're just always being like, some bad shit's about to happen.
It's coming.
And so it's like, you can maybe, guess that Marxist epidemiologist is going to predict 12 out of the next 4 pandemics, but seeing as what's happened, it's still, it's something to not shrug off at all.
Hell yeah. Hell yeah. Hey, well, I just want to say thank you, Eamon, for doing this piece. Thank you for being willing to come talk to us. I really, really learned a lot talking with you and reading your piece, and want to big up Rob Wallace, you know, and like make sure people go check out his work directly, support him financially.
Yeah, he's got a Patreon. He's a great Facebook presence. He does have another book coming out soon, he said. So
Cool.
Yeah.
Hey, well, go pick up a copy of The Nation, get a physical, subscribe, support Eamon. Look for Eamon's other work, other writing, a lot of good pieces out there. We appreciate you coming by. I think we're going to hang out and do some bonus material for the patrons. So if you're not signed up for Patreon yet, make sure you go to patreon.com/moneypowerlandsolidarity. We got options for all income ranges. We got some bonus material up there, and you help keep us going. Money, power, land, solidarity.
We need money, land, solidarity. If you funny, stand very far away from me. We have running plans.